Hello and good evening and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel Club of the month for the month of September, even though it's October that we're having this meeting, but it's the September book. Our book this month is a really terrific book that is smart and wise and thoughtful in its new world by David Jesus Vignolli. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, great. I always worry about messing up people's names. Thank you for being here, by the way. Originally, so David's in the UK. Originally, we were supposed to do just a video, a Skype thing, and then it worked out that he was at New York Comic Con, so he flew out, and he's literally here for like 12 hours in San Francisco, and taking a red eye back. So this is genuinely great that you're here to be in person and talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
No, thank you for making a great comic. That's always, this is, the work is what's important, and I thought this was a very important and a very special book and a very thoughtful book, and a very interesting book too. But let's start. I always start my first question, and I love this question: why comics? Of all the things you could be doing, why? What is it about comics that appeals to you?
Yeah, I think why comics, because I love comics, I love the medium, but when I was small, so I love kind of drawing. So I love this combination of drawing and storytelling, to have a narrative. So that's what actually fascinates me. So when I was small, like I was reading the Sunday comics, Calvin and Hobbes, and kind of all these cartoons that you have in the Sunday comics. We have kind of some, because I'm from Brazil, so I had like some different comic books also on Sunday. And also start reading Spider-Man. So this kind of really kind of entered so much into my personality. So I think that's why I've chosen to tell the story in comics.
Yeah. So you grew up in Brazil. That actually was not a thing I knew.
Yeah, in Rio.
Yeah. And so what's the local comics market like? Are there local?
Yeah, there's a kind of a big comic book called Monica.
Okay.
Monica's Gang. So it's a kind of a girl, and she has some friends, and they go into play some adventures and so on. They actually have done even a kind of a live action now movie of this comic book. So it's kind of really big. So everyone kind of reads these comics. And there's also some comics from Argentina as well, but most of the comics, I think, they are American comics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And is the local homegrown scene like a significant market?
Look, this I think for children the market is very big.
Yeah.
So I think everyone kind of sometimes, if they learn how to read, reading Monica, for example. But then when it gets more like to teenagers, then it gets a little bit more difficult. So we don't have we have some artists doing, but we don't have so much of a market.
Sure.
So now there's a lot of mangas as well that teenagers are reading, but I think there's not so many of Brazilian comics filling up this gap.
Yeah.
I would say.
When did you move to the UK?
This was 10 years ago because my wife is Polish. Yeah.
Okay.
But then I moved to Europe, and then we decided to move to the UK. Yeah, because it was somehow closer to Brazil. I think it's easier to travel.
Sure. That's interesting. That puts you in an interesting position when I think about current UK politics, right? That you're married to a Polish woman in a country that maybe is not that friendly to immigrants, and
I think probably don't feel much because living in London, people are kind of very nice and very open-minded, so you don't feel so much actually. I think it's more up north of the country where there's some more of this feeling against the foreigners.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. You are, I'm assuming, anti-Brexit? Is that?
Yeah, for sure.
It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Yeah.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But it's a part of a process that the country needs to go through, I think. Yeah, so it's because what I believe, it's also there is a lot of people who went through the crisis and never really managed to recover. No? So these people are very unsatisfied.
Sure, sure. Well, I think that's equally true in America as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, and never satisfied by it. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it's difficult times, I would say.
Yeah. So did you study art? Did you study?
Yeah, so I went to university in Rio, so I went to study kind of art and graphic design. So basically I was studying at the same time like drawing and everything, but at the same time also looking at the market, maybe graphic design, I can make more of a living rather than just drawing. So
Sure.
I studied both.
Sure, but not specifically comics. Yeah.
No, I mean, there was actually some disciplines that there were comics, but not really comics in the sense that the university wasn't about comics. I did a lot of courses, like with other kind of comic book authors. So I was studying a lot of narrative.
Okay.
There was some kind of good Argentinian authors, so I was studying also that.
Yeah, and what was the sort of the prognosis of what your creative possibilities were at that point?
So I was doing all the time. I was doing comics, but like zines, not like fan zines.
Sure. Yeah.
But there was a possibility to work, for example, for Dismonica Studios or doing animation as well, because there's also like studios of animation. Hi. Yeah. So there was a perspective to work with illustration, but not so much with comics.
Without comics, yeah, illustration more, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, how did you make the jump to doing comics then?
Okay, so this is when I moved to the UK. So I started working more and more with illustration. So then I decided, no, let me focus now into my graphic novel, and then I did like 60 pages of my first graphic novel, A Girl in the Himalayas, and then I sent to Boom Studios.
Okay.
And after 6 months, they said, we like it and want to publish it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you literally just took a flyer kind of on drawing 60 pages with, you didn't know who was going to publish it?
Yeah. So I kind of took some time. So I decided, look, I will make money enough for me to stop for 3 months and to dedicate entirely to the graphic novel. So that's what I did. Yeah.
And how did you decide on Boom as the one that you wanted to work with?
I think, I knew a lot of mouse gods, but because I focused on Archaea more than Boom, I didn't know actually at that time they were part of the same company. But so I loved mouse gods, so I thought, no, I think it fits that kind of universe.
Okay.
I would say.
So it was literally like you were buying these books in the store and you went,
pretty much.
oh, this is the one that I want to work with. Oh, that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
That's really
Pretty
fascinating.
much, because also they work a lot with fantasy as well.
Yeah.
And that's what I like also to work with.
Yeah. And you just sort of sent them an over the transom pitch, or did you have an agent, or?
No, I didn't have an agent because they have still kind of. If you go to their website, there's an open submission, so anyone can send like I think it's like 10 pages of comics, and then a kind of a synopsis, how everything happens in the story, and that's it really.
Yeah. But you sent them 60, or not?
No, I had 16 ready, but I had to follow kind of the rules of submission, so I sent just like the 10 pages, and then later they asked, do you have more? Yeah, I have. And
I have 60. Here you go, buddy. Yeah, sounds great. Who was the editor who got back to you?
Cameron Cheetah.
Okay.
And Sierra. Sierra Hunt. So
And were they? I mean, what was the reaction? Was it enthusiastic or was it tentative or?
It was enthusiastic. They said, "Oh, we really like." I mean, when you have only 10 pages, you just can see a little bit of the story, no?
Sure.
So I think probably the editors, they look at if the narrative is working.
Yeah.
If the dialogues are good.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of that trailer. It's almost like
Sure.
a trailer
Sure.
for a movie.
How did you feel comfortable with doing a long form book that was, I don't remember, A Girl in Himalayas is 120 probably pages or so? Were you, was that daunting at all to you to because that's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work to do 120 pages of a book.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. I think for me it was kind of natural. I didn't feel so much of a pressure. I just felt the pressure to get, like an engaging book. So I put a lot of effort so that the narrative was consistent and that, like sometimes in the page you have the connection to the next page and that people understand what's going on, because sometimes, from one pen to the other, people are like, what's going on here?
Sure.
So there was a lot of attention on that.
Sure.
But I think it wasn't a big deal. Actually, I want even to have more pages, but in the end they said no, like 120 is the limit.
Right. And so, I mean, it strikes me as really bold to be able to try to tell a 120-page story out of the gate, right? So, how did you learn sort of the texture to because we're talking about like panel transitions and things like that, right? Those are not natural things to learn necessarily. What were you studying? What were you looking at? What was your examples?
I was looking at a lot of storyboards. So I think maybe you can even feel, if you read, that feels a little bit like a storyboard. Because this is something that I'm kind of really looking to in Japanese comics. The sense of time.
Yeah.
And this is something that's very powerful in Japanese comics, that you have the feeling that you are there at that moment and the things are happening.
Yeah.
But for that to happen, you need more pages.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what I feel that we have in Western comics in general is that from one panel to the other, a lot of things happen.
Sure.
And you just have a narration. Then Hulk jumps and punches.
Yeah.
And then you just have one panel.
Sure.
But you could have like a lot of pages to tell the same thing. So that's what I was looking for, kind of a storyboard. So some sort of sense that the reader is there when the action is happening.
Yeah.
And that's why I like to have more pages than to have less pages, because then you have more possibilities to explore. Like maybe there is a drop falling from a tree.
Yeah.
Like you kind of show the environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting because manga and Western comics are both defined by their serialization, right? And manga is serialized weekly, generally in 8 to 10 page chunks, and so that's why they're able to put that time to the drop coming down. Whereas Western comics are serialized monthly, so you can't waste time, right? Because the audience won't deal with it, right? It's fascinating to me, the cultural difference between the two things, and that you focused on manga as your lodestone.
Yeah, and I have the feeling, actually, even series nowadays, they try to follow, I mean, not kind of Japanese pace, but like more like a slow pace, that things happen slowly.
Sure.
That you build up kind of something to happen perhaps in the 5th episode.
Sure.
Sometimes it takes too long.
Sure.
But they try to build up that tension, So
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit like that, like not to tell like a film, because sometimes things has to happen very quickly, but more like a series,
Sure.
that you take the time for things to happen.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think American audiences would often argue that the longer you take, the more or the less interesting it is to the reader. You lose a certain amount of, I don't even actually know what I'm talking about. I'm just babbling at that point. It's because there's different things and different things work in different ways. But serialized comics need to have a thought within the pages of of the serialization, right? Because unlike, so in Japan, they're anthologies, right?
Yeah.
It's not, you're not just getting 8 pages a week, you're getting 8 pages a week of 6 different serials, right? And so there's a different pace to it than in American comics. American comics are almost laconic in that way, that they're slow and their pacing is different. It's a very different thing. I don't know. So when you did you at any point think when you were doing Girl in the Himalayas that it would be serialized? No, it was always intended to be a book.
Look, I thought that would be a sort of a series. I thought, but at the same time, the editors, they said, look, it has to be, the first has to be like closed as would be a film. You
Right.
leave some sort of open end,
Right.
but you have to close it. Because sometimes a lot of mangas, the first book, it's really kind of open. You don't know what's going
Sure.
on. So
Absolutely.
you need to read the second, but it's not the case
Yeah.
with my books. No.
Yeah. No, I agree. Was the response to Girl in the Himalayas such that Boom was then, and Acacia, then whatever you want to do next? Or did you need to pitch New World?
I pitched New World, but they asked like, could you? We got a good response on during the
Yeah.
Himalayas, so
Yeah. So
please
they
pick
wanted
something.
more.
They wanted more.
Yeah,
They wanted more. Yeah.
Okay. And what was how was the pitch for this different than the pitch for Girl?
I think probably what I was talking to them was talking to the editor that they wanted something that was very personal. Would be nice something that's really personal to you, David. And then I was thinking, okay, maybe I'll talk about my heritage.
Sure.
Yeah, but I think it's all the books, they are personal in a way or the other. No? So, for example, I love kind of India, the yoga, the Himalayas. So that's why I wrote Girl in the Himalayas. And
Sure.
now I'm going to New World because it's part of the.
Yeah, I
my
mean,
past.
it seems to me that if you're going to spend 6 months to create a book, or more maybe,
Yeah,
that you have to be involved in it,
yeah,
right?
yeah. You have to kind of feel eager and to tell that story.
Yeah. And to sustain it over a period of time, right?
Yeah, because it's kind of a relationship of a long-term relationship. As you said, like it's sometimes 1 year, 2 years.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the process, you can get tired, and then you have really to be in love with that piece of work.
Yeah. So, okay, so this is a thing I would love to talk about a little bit is you have the blank page in front of you. It's nothing. You've got nothing in front of you, and then you've got to summon something out of nothingness. What's that like? How do you do it?
Yeah, I think probably for me it works, and I think most of the artists, like we are seeing things, we are watching a series, we are watching a movie, and then some ideas are there, and then you just file them, and then say like, maybe in the future I may do that project, and then at some point, like the page is blank, and then say, that idea that I had like 5 years ago, maybe it's the time now to come to life.
Yeah. This seems really personal, though. This doesn't seem like there are a lot of things. I don't see another television show or a movie in this, right? I really feel like it was your own thought and your own world and your own.
Yeah, what happens that I started kind of to realize that we tell a lot of stories during the Second World War because it was very clear who's the good and who's the bad.
Yeah.
And then I thought, why don't we tell stories in different times?
Sure.
And for example, we also have like the Wild West.
Yeah.
These are kind of genres that are very well established. I said, why can we not kind of try to explore different times and create perhaps a new genre? And then I thought maybe the discovery of the Americas would be a good point. And this was for me very important because I wanted to tell something that specifically taking place in Brazil, but at the same time it's equal to all the Americas, no?
Sure.
Because you have like the natives, the African Americans, and then you have the whites, the Europeans coming. So this is equal to all kind of the whole kind of Americas.
Yeah.
So as I also published in the book here, so I thought that would be also important that it's personal, but at the same time it has some relevance.
Yes.
To the American audience.
Yeah. No, I think it very much does, and I think that you guys are nodding, right? Like it is really relevant. Yeah, and it feels current. It doesn't feel like we're looking at times past. It feels like we're looking at now, even though clearly it happened a long time ago.
But at the same time, it's funny because I didn't want to tell something that was realistic enough that would, make people suffer or feel guilty or anything. I wanted something that, okay, this is mostly entertainment.
Yes.
And then there is a background that's real.
Yeah.
There's a history behind.
Yeah.
But I wanted that's more like entertaining, a little bit more like Django from Tarantino, there is the slavery, but it's in the background.
Sure.
The most important is the hero journey.
Sure. And was this in your pitch, all of this, or?
Yeah, the picture was, it's just funny because I was telling the editor, there is this native girl that will meet the African slave, and then he said, David, I'm not sure you are the right person to tell this story. And then I said, but I have all this heritage, all these people, they were part of my ancestry. And that's, okay, so then you can tell this story.
Oh, it's okay now.
It's okay now.
Yeah, that's funny. Oh, that's really funny.
Because he was afraid, like maybe you could have some criticism about you are telling the story, but you have nothing to do with it.
Sure. No, it feels very sincere to me, and it feels very true and very real. And yeah, no, I really like this book. I gotta say. Do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, just wondering about the forest character. It was a little.
Which characters?
They had on the boat
the sailor. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. The person who heals.
You mean the assistant?
The
assistant. The assistant, yeah.
Oh, I see the assistant. Okay.
Because he looked like the Egyptian.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. So that's a character kind of interesting. But I was curious about what that symbolized.
Yeah, because so what I looked about, it's the Indian mythology. So the idea is that the sailor, and I think this is described in the book, that he actually, his ship sinks near the Indian Ocean, and then he's taken by some Indian sages, and then kind of recover him, and then he's now has this kind of powerful ship. And then there's this Horus, this character comes, and this is actually a part of an Indian mythology. It's called Garuda. There is a sort of a half man and half bird.
Okay.
And this is almost like someone who is helping him there in the ship and doing all the work there. But it's just a reference to the Indian mythology that I think maybe there's some connection to the Egyptian mythology as well. This I don't know, but it's just a reference to this character.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of, is it magical realism? Is it, there's a lot of magic and mythology here, which feels true to me, but is not anything I've read or encountered before. Yeah. And I'm wondering.
What was interesting is that the magic was equal to all three. The indigenous, the whites, and the blacks all had the same magic. Where it was these evil spirits taking over the whites, and the black, the African American could use the flute to uncover it, and then the locals knew that they had to kill it.
Yeah.
So that was what, to me, I was like, that's interesting that they're all seeing the same magic.
Yeah, and it's from the same roots, but they're also not roots. I don't think that I know where. It seemed like they're from your head rather than from.
Yeah, I think there is. They're not directly connected to certain things. For example, the African American has the flute because I think and this is fantastic if you see from. I think it's mostly countries in the Americas. If you see the power of the African culture, because they were taking the culture from them, but what they could do without having any contact with their ancestors, it's to create art. So I thought that it's very well manifested in music. So I thought that maybe flute would suit like the African character.
Yeah.
So, and as you said, like they have equally kind of different powers, no?
Yeah.
It was almost like it was given by the gods, no? Like these powers to the different tribes of the world.
Sure.
Let's say.
In a way, and this is really simplistic, I actually feel like this book is kind of a superhero comic. Yeah. Right? Because everybody's got some sort of fantastic power.
Yeah.
But it's all internally consistent, which is fascinating to me. That you have this mythology that you've built. You've built a mythology here, not just you're not just taking sort of the cultural touchstones.
Yeah. There are certain things as I mentioned, like there's some associations that I created. For example, there is the indigenous. For example, they worship like the thunder. And there's a lot of thunder, for example, in those parts in South America. So I thought, oh, the thunder, the bow, because they also use a lot of the bow and the arrow.
Yeah.
So I made these combinations because there was connection in their culture. And even like the ship, for example, come from some old scriptures in Indian mythology. They say that, for example, some sages, they could travel galaxies, and then you read them. This is superhero story.
Yeah.
These are superhero
Right?
stories. So then I just, so this guy could have a ship that there is almost like a life, that it could travel time and space.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, I have a perspective, obviously, because I run a comic book store in America, and so superheroes are so much part of it. And when we offer books to people, we always offer the runner-ups. And we always try to offer them a superhero comic, and nobody picked the superhero comic this month because I think this is a superhero comic in so many ways. There's fantastical powers, but they're rooted to your culture and they're rooted to a thing that you believe in and a thing that you think is true. And the underdog wins, and that's the nature of the superhero in a way, is that the underdog wins.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I was very influenced because I read a lot of comic books when I was young, superhero comic books. And I think, I don't know if you can feel, but I think one author that really influenced me was Frank Miller. So I think a lot also of the transitions of panels I love like the sequences, like sometimes of a fraction of seconds, he does a lot of panels.
Sure. Oh, very much so. And I even to the point where she's using the bow and then the thunder strikes, and that very much feels like Miller to me in many ways. Yeah, I can see that. Wow, that's cool. All right. Yes.
I was wondering, you touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how your ancestry might have influenced some of the characters in the book. If any, are any of them based on folks that you know or part of your own genealogy or history?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, because I was even mentioning this to Cameron, my editor in this book. I was telling I almost had to connect to my ancestry, so I would have my ancestors talking to each other and how this story would unfold. But the sad thing actually about the ancestry, like the indigenous and the Africans, that it was completely cut, the connection. So just some like minimum things like some roots that we eat in Brazil, for example, that they have some sort of indigenous roots, or the Africans have maybe some words in the language that were introduced. But in terms of culture, like the church basically didn't allow anything really to emerge. So there were no kind of stories really from real story from my family or
Yeah.
so it's almost like I would say like 90% Portuguese really culture then.
And is it all through the church? I confess that I don't know enough about.
No, it's just that, for example, the church believed at that time, and the colonization believed that these are savages, not people really that.
Right.
So we have to bring the church so that they can evolve as human beings.
Yeah.
So all the other practices they were suppressed. So you couldn't, even the language was, something inferior. So everything was kind of suppressed. There is even one part in the book because I use also a lot of real text. There is some text about a description of Americo Vespucci. I don't know if So there was some description that he was telling that they kill the people and everything. And there is even one frame in the book that shows him talking America, like as the girl would be awakening. And this is actually based on a real painting that exists. And this painting shows the Americo Vespucci, and there is a cross also that he's holding, also showing that the church is coming to awaken this sleepy America.
Right.
Because the sleepy Americas was the idea that those cultures that were there were just like sleepy cultures.
Yeah. That was actually the most disturbing part to me in this book was that sequence with the Amerigo Vespucci and how do you pronounce her name, by the way?
Americo Vespucci.
No. How do you pronounce her, the lead
Oh,
character?
sorry. Iracema.
Iracema. I would never have guessed that from the...
Yeah, so it's funny because Iracema, it's based on a character from a book from the 19th century in Brazil.
Okay.
Because there was... it's interesting because most of people, they don't know. There was a king in Brazil, and this was a European king. And then when he came to Brazil, he said, look, we are following too much Europe. Let's do some books now about the Indian culture, the native culture. So, and then the author wrote this book, Iracema, and Iracema falls in love with a white man. And Iracema, it's actually an anagram for America.
Oh, okay.
So if you use the words, you will say like America. You can write America. Because the funny thing is that at that time, and this is also something that I wanted to show in the book, the people would call what we call now Americas would be called America. Like, for example, my family, there's also a part of my family, the Vignolli family. It's an Italian family. They said, let's go to America. But they weren't going to Brazil. But they thought that was, it's not that they thought that they were going to the U.S.
Right.
But as that's what they called at that time.
Sure. It was all American.
Yeah, they call all everything.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm curious about the whole process that you have in terms of the character development and narrative development, because this feels very personal and very cultural and very close to you. So now I'm wondering, how much freedom did you have in terms of putting all your thoughts and emotions into this book, and how much of it was like the editors just like, oh no, you can't put that?
I had like 100.
Solid, but so sensitive and so personal.
I had like 100% freedom, really. The editor said, like, you have. There was actually even one moment I said, there is a moment in the end, but probably I shouldn't tell the spoiler here, that I'm kind of very direct to what happens. I say, look, and actually I wouldn't put that in the book. And then my editor said, look, David, you have to put something strong also in the book. I said, okay, then I'll put. But I didn't want, because especially I want to, publish here in America, in the U.S. So I was a little bit concerned. Sometimes it's just good to suggest, but somehow it came spontaneously.
Yeah.
And the editor said, "No, David, you have to finish with something strong."
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that's the message of this book. I would say it's that really kind of to build up in a kind of a better society that we have really to take in consideration, what happened in the past, so that we can work together to build something better in the future.
Sure.
But I didn't want to say like you are guilty or anything, because I think it should be something that we have to live in the past. Otherwise, there will be too much kind of anger or lack of forgiveness. We have to leave the things in the past, for sure, understand what happened and improve. For example, just give an example of what's happening in Brazil now, like how treat the Amazon forest. Now, if we have heard the indigenous, this would never have happened. But this is for sure a problem that's, I think the whole world has this kind of, how can I say this, development, fascination, ambition, choice. So we really destroying the whole planet.
Sure.
It's a very sensitive point, because I'm not saying that development is bad, but it's just how it's happening, because we are really kind of destroying the whole planet.
Yeah. Well, I don't think the development per se is bad, but I think the greed is bad.
Yeah.
And with what's going on in the Amazon, it strikes me as about greed more than anything else. It's about people thinking there's this demand for beef, so we should burn down the forest so we can have more places to have cattle run free. And that, great, you make your money in the short term, but then where does that leave us at the end of the day, Yeah. And these are things that we have to struggle with if we're going to have a future. There is no future if we don't have a healthy forest that's the lungs of the world, and
So, but it's also very complicated, because sometimes the people who are burning there, they are very poor.
Sure.
So how can you balance the system? No?
Sure.
Because then we have a situation that's very difficult to control.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. It's not easy, and it's not. If only it were easy, then we could fix stuff.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult, so it's very, very, very hard to fix, because the people who are in control and the people who have power don't necessarily care about the poor or the indigenous or their issues, right? They just they care about power and money, and that doesn't bring us anyplace good, I don't think, at least. It's the monsters, right? I mean, the thing that felt almost the truest about this book is how it posits that there were monsters on the world, and that as man became more sophisticated, that the monsters had to become us. And I thought that was a really kind of amazing analogy.
And also that it's not necessarily the white man.
Right,
But
exactly.
It's the monster that takes over the monster. The monster that can take over the white man.
Yeah. I thought that was that really struck me as very powerful, and something that we should struggle against. And we can't see those monsters. We've lost that view of it. What made you? Where did this come from in your thought?
For example, there was kind of an illustration also from the 16th century that I found, and that showed like the Portuguese king on the top of they said it's a monster, but it looked like a frog, but it was like a monster for them at that time. And then this was symbolizing that the Portuguese conquered the ocean. And then I said, there is some sort of food for thought here. Because you have the idea of the kind of controlling the monster. It's the idea also that they can come and spread all over the world and control, invade and colonize. So it was an interesting, and for sure, the idea of that kind of we are also kind of our kind of worst enemies, I would say. That's the idea of the monsters. And also, as you've mentioned, you know, like it's not like about these people are bad or these people, but there are some forces that they really want the destruction of humanity. You know?
Sure.
People like Hitler, no? This kind of horrible people that they just want to see people fighting against each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that the thing that is important to them is not our shared humanity.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's one of the things I love about this book so much is how it really is about our shared humanity and about how the indigenous people see the slavery that's going on, and they react badly to it. Of course they would, you know? And yeah, I thought it really worked on so many levels there. I really, really liked that in so many ways. Yeah. Ask another question. No, I'm looking at you.
Me?
Yeah, you, Brent.
Oh no, I'm thinking about this is one of my. I just love all these like Easter eggs, right? Like things that I was like, oh, this is. As I was reading the book, so many of the characters' names stuck with me because they're just not names that I hear, and they're interesting things. And I wondered, like, I wonder what that might be. And it was sort of fun to maybe Google around a little bit. But I love. This is the first time really sitting down and hearing like, oh, well, then I thought of this 16th century painting, right? Like these Easter eggs that you everything from Frank Miller comics, right, to classic 16th century Portuguese paintings is just blowing my mind in the best way that I'm just like absorbing all of it.
Yeah.
And I really love, so working on so many levels,
Yeah.
I enjoyed while reading it. And now that you're like, oh, you thought there was 8 levels? Let me tell you about the 600 basement levels you didn't even know. It's making it, I think, that much more poignant and wise and exciting and important. Right, and it's just exciting to hear you peel all these back and know even more of what you gave to this book that we get to enjoy. So that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah. The your editors at Boom. I mean, how were they processing it on this same level, or were they? Oh, this is just a fun story.
No, they were processing the same level because I think when you tell the story, you know, like about the discovery, you know, about the colonization, there's no way you cannot relate to nowadays, isn't it? Because we are seeing just the consequences.
Sure.
So I think they were just like wanted to go for it and to tell the message, to take in consideration that people would definitely kind of relate to racism, all these problems that we have nowadays.
Okay.
Yeah.
I very much agree. Let's maybe talk about craft a little bit. Do you pen and paper, digital? How do you work?
Look, what I do is I start with the thumbnails, but this I do all on paper.
Okay.
But I do the thumbnails as I would be doing a storyboard. So I don't think in pages, but for me, I have to make sure that this narrative is working first, and then I separate and divide them into pages, all those small panels into pages, and then I go digitally, and then I do first like almost like a complete page, but really sketchy.
Okay.
So that I can send to the editors. But I do like with all the dialogues and everything so that they can read and feel how it's working.
Do you write in English or Portuguese?
I write... The first thumbnails I write in Portuguese, and then I write in English.
Okay.
Yeah, so... Especially some of the texts, they were kind of originally in Portuguese, so I also kind of included in the... in the text first in Portuguese. I just actually she was talking about some Easter eggs. Just there is also one scene when the children and the dogs. So because this was actually a common practice in some parts, not that actually the Portuguese but the Spanish, they would throw some, some dogs to attack children.
Yeah.
So this was an awful thing, but I tried to actually to look from the other side, and maybe the children perhaps they would have powers to control the dogs.
Right.
That's what I used in the book. But
Yeah.
but there was a lot of small things that actually really happened
Yeah.
that I used, and so a lot of this text, a lot of these books that I was reading, they were in Portuguese. So I wrote first in Portuguese, and then I would translate into English. And as I said, I would first do everything, the sketches digitally, and then I would also finalize digitally.
Okay.
And my wife also helped to do the colors
Okay.
for this book, so
Oh,
this
that's
was fun.
interesting. Okay. Very good. Your thumbnails are. I mean, are you doing them small? Are you doing them big? What kind of? How do you work?
It's pretty small. I think it's like it's funny when I talk about sizes because it's completely different than in the UK. You know, like it's
Sure.
almost like a letter size.
Okay.
Yeah, so I do like kind of a big kind of a notebook,
Okay.
like from letter side, and I start doing like the sketches there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everything starts actually by sketching. Even like the whole story, I try to do like almost as you would be seeing, you know, like those old tapestries that would tell like the stories of the Bible. So I try to see the you know the whole story in one image. First, I do sketches, so I know when it starts and how it's going to end, and then I start kind of telling the story.
Okay.
But this book, there was a lot of changes. There was a lot of
Well, I
changes.
imagine.
to the book.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it feels like it too. How much of this the changes were you doing it, and how much was feedback from your editors?
There was a lot of feedback, and it was for good because it was a very complex story.
Yeah.
So we had to. In the beginning, I wanted to do like more like you go and you see one scene where the sailor is doing something, and then you cut, and then you have the native, and then you cut, and you have then the African slave. But then we decided to do like tell the story from the point of view of the native, the native girl.
Which I think was probably a
It
better
was the
decision,
best
yeah.
because it was the best, I think, because you have to make things simple for people to
Sure.
understand.
Sure. Well, it also gives you a way to clearly see the through line of the world, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that her experience is different than our experience, right, allows, to me at least, a lot of the magic
Okay,
to
yeah,
succeed,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because if you had cut to a European, like I wouldn't have bought a lot of,
All right, yeah, yeah.
you know?
Yeah, because it's from her point of view,
Yeah.
so maybe she sees all those monsters,
Sure.
but actually are real people, no?
Sure.
So this is not clear.
But even like the small stuff like that, you have sort of 4 pages at the top of the book where they're talking about how you get papayas out of a tree.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like that rooted it in a really real place for me, so that once it became magical, that I had a rooting that made sense to me, you know. Whereas if you had started with a European point of view, or or the slave story where they came and they took us, it wouldn't have done the same thing, I don't think.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And also I tried as much as possible to give some sort of idea that they are different somehow. Perhaps even a little bit how they speak. Not so much how they speak, because this could make a confusion sometimes. But how how they see the world.
How they see the world, very
Yeah.
much, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the rhythm of how they think. I mean, that came across very clearly to me.
Okay.
How much research did you do for the indigenous people, for the slaves, or was it just sort of osmosis?
I did a lot of research. Especially, I had to read a book of one. There was a tribe called Yanomamis. I don't know if you ever heard, but they live in the Amazon forest. So there was a. So it's interesting because a lot of things you don't need to create, but sometimes if you read, and you are like, oh my God, because there's a description in this book of the Yanomamis where he's telling that he went to give a speech. this is like a leader, no, of this tribe. Went to London to give a speech, and then he was telling when he was there in London, the spirits of the bee came to him and said, "Save us, because otherwise we'll be destroyed." And then you are like, "Oh my God, how can that happen?" Huh? But for him, it was like, like just another day, you know.
Sure.
You could see the spirit,
Sure.
see and talk to him, but
Sure.
like feels fantastic. And then I said, "Wow, it's amazing."
Yeah.
I even tried to put that in the book, but it didn't work out. But there's this feeling that they can see much more than we can. So I was trying to add this to the book. So there was a lot of research in this sense. as
Sure.
well. Yeah.
Sure. It all felt really true to me, even though it was really fantastic. Like.
Starting with that huge parrot, not the one you.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah,
huge
yeah,
parrot.
right. And we open with this giant bird, and it's like, well, what?
I thought that people would think, "Look, I think he got the perspective wrong."
No, but then when she flies on him. And
Yeah, when she flies, I think it's clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that because also there is a name that also the guy mentions in this book. There's a his spirit, because they have different names for the spirits of the forest. No? So I thought that if everything's fantastic, maybe we have really to make it even more fantastic. Isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Because no one knows. Maybe there was some species that existed
Sure.
before, but they were just killed. No, by
Yeah.
it. Like we go into this.
like the dodos.
Yeah, like the dodos. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's even a mention to
Yeah.
the dodos.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think my favorite line there is that the Dutch think they're really tasty. Which, struck me as, again, really true. Was that a thing that was real? Did the Dutch find the dodos tasty?
I don't know if they found tasty, but I know that they were responsible to extinct the bird because they are very, docile. So people would just come and take them, like very easily.
Yeah. Wow.
So there is really a lot of small things now
Yeah.
that you mentioned. The things.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel like I could pull 10 more things like that out of this book that were, is this true? It doesn't matter if it's true. It feels true. It seems right. And the fact that you're saying that, oh, yes, no, I researched that. And this part is, that makes sense to me. Okay, so you're working on pen and paper to do thumbnails. This is what is this? 156 pages, 158 pages, something like that. 57. How much of your thumbnails are drawn and redrawn and drawn and redrawn, and how much of it is you got it right the first time and you're good?
Actually, I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
Because I'm just trying to remember. But I think most of the thumbnails I do it like... I do it only kind of once. I think much more focus on having kind of this digitalized to see if the narrative works.
Okay.
The thumbnails I change a lot of times. Even when the pages are already done, I change also the thumbnails, and then I come back and finalize again the pages. So I think probably the focus that I put the most is on the narrative to make sure if it's working as a story, as a book. Yeah.
How because this is not a skill I have, right? I sell comics for a living. I don't tell stories. Help me understand how, over the course of, say, a 10-page sequence, a 15-page sequence, that you find that through line as an author. Does that make sense? Did I ask that question correctly?
You mean like in terms of narrative, kind of a personal narrative?
The narrative, yeah.
I think it's funny because I think there's a lot of themes that they are repeating. Huh?
Yeah.
Like, I think Alan Moore, you can, feel like this is Alan Moore book because you tend to repeat the same themes over and over, right? So,
But I always feel like with Alan Moore that he spent way more time thinking about the story before he even started writing it. Right?
That's true.
Like he spent
That's true.
so much time
Yeah.
trying to think about that and make the clockwork mesh together.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
Whereas this feels a lot more intuitive to me.
Yeah. It's much more
Although
intuitive.
Moore always has a problem ending things. So.
Well, yeah. Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
But it's interesting because if I have never been to Northampton, but if you know, in England, if you feel like maybe, for example, for the same way, for example, I feel like for Miyazaki, that a lot of the talent of Miyazaki of telling a story, it comes also from the Japanese culture.
Sure, absolutely.
The same way, like the New Game and Alamo, a lot comes also from the English sort of kind of way of telling a story. So it's interesting how much we are also influenced by, by our culture and our countries,
Sure.
isn't it?
So, do you feel like your influences are more your Brazilian influences or your English influences?
It's funny because I don't think, I might have been influenced by something for sure, but I don't see so much kind of influence of English.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I see much more like, I wouldn't even say Brazilian. It's funny because I think the books that really inspire me to do this book, they were mostly kind of American books. So it's a bit of
Okay.
So I feel that the narrative, I think it's very American, but for sure there is something there that might be like kind of a little different. Maybe some approach that is a little bit more, I wouldn't say political, but question certain things that maybe American books wouldn't do it very often.
Sure.
I felt like even like the way, for example, Alan Moore writes, you can see that he comes also from a maybe like more like a working class background.
Sure.
So in the text, there's a lot of also like a criticism on the system. So you see, even like in Watchmen, there's so much criticism, so much like a irony at the same time. And it tells so much also like about his background. So I think there is also something, but I think maybe the Brazilian side doesn't make it so dark. But it just comes here and there, maybe when I'm talking about illusion in that other book, or maybe the monster side in this book. There is something about the human nature that's not entirely perfect. Maybe this is something a little Brazilian. Maybe.
Yeah. I'm wondering how much maybe the magic is Brazilian.
I think the magic, I tried as much as I could to do something like Miyazaki. Because I don't know if there's so much magic. If I would know more, maybe native Indian stories.
Yeah.
But again, I have the feeling that there was so much suppressed, like all these cultures that there's, especially the church was completely against any of this magical or anything.
Sure. Well, you can't control people if there's magic.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, right?
Yeah. So this was also the Celtic traditions in Europe. They were all kind of destroyed. So there is a lot of cultures that we won't know now what really would have happened if they wouldn't be kind of destroyed. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But for sure, the focus of the book, it was really much more to show like how we can work together. So it's much more kind of a positive. That's why I didn't want to show any brutality or any aspect. And I think I was even telling my editor, I think it's almost like as my three ancestors would sit together and say, look, let's work together instead of fighting against each other. Because I think this is one point that maybe helped me sell the book, is that I was part of these three ethnic groups, but at the same time I was from none of them.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
So it makes a kind of gives a distance, I cannot like point, oops, there is not anyone that was, because I was the hero and the enemy
Yeah.
at the same time. No?
Yeah.
Like it's,
Yeah. Well, I think that makes it stronger, right? Is
Yeah.
taking different cultures and blending them and mixing them, and
Yeah.
that makes us stronger. It doesn't make us weaker, you know? I mean, it's certainly, I think, the through line in American and British politics as well is that the other makes us weaker, which
Yeah, yeah.
seems to me to be insane. I can't understand why people would think that ever.
Yeah.
Bringing things together, the melting pot. To me, that's the strength of America. That's the most wonderful, beautiful thing that we can be, is that we take everything and we put it together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So it seems like you enjoyed doing research for
Yeah.
this. Yeah, you talk about it with a lot of passion, which is very exciting. And then you also mentioned at the beginning of the talk a little bit, like maybe wanting to start a new genre with this time that hasn't been as explored as others.
Yeah.
Do you think your future work will be creating more pieces for this maybe new genre, whether it's within the same world as a direct sequel or something?
Yeah, I would like to do something in this universe. It's just that, yeah, it takes some time sometimes, to create a genre, no? Because it's a movement, no? That many authors they follow, no? I think it's like in the Wild West, like there was the movies, there were some people writing stories. There is even one guy in Brazil that, like wrote like 20 books in the Wild West and stuff like that. It's like ninjas, no? Some people write, no, about ninjas. People write ninjas in the U.S., in Brazil, but they never really met the ninjas.
Yeah. Well, Frank Miller, right? Frank Miller's never met a ninja in his life.
So it's you never know what sort of story will become a genre or not.
Sure. Sure.
But I was just trying to go to a time where it's very difficult to see any stories on those times, because it's also very difficult to see who is the good and who is the bad.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of things like I even wrote that in a comment on Facebook. I was like, at the discovery of the Americas, and the guy, discovery? This was an invasion, and that's true. But it's so much.
Depends on your point of view, right?
Yeah, exactly. Depends on the point of view. But we all say like discovery, no? But for the native side, it's completely absurd, and it's an invasion.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a time that's very sensitive, I would say.
Yeah.
To talk.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I would love to see more here. I would love to see these characters again. I would love to see what happened next to them.
I had some ideas, but let's see if there is enough kind of feedback.
Yeah.
Good feedback.
Well, for what it's worth, there are almost no copies available in distribution, which means it sold really well, that they've sold out and there are not copies to be had right now.
Okay,
so that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Let's see what that actually means.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm assuming the boom is, this is a fantastic book, we want to do more with you. Yeah?
Yeah. I don't know if they want to do like more of this book.
Sure,
This
sure.
will depend. Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna keep backtracking to craft, because I always fall back to that as a thing to talk about. How long did it take you to do your thumbnails for the 160 pages?
The thumbnails for the 160
157.
pages.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was just trying to... I think would probably take me kind of a month.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Wow,
But,
that's really fast.
Just for the thumbnails.
Yeah.
But then I do later like the sketch of the pages. So so I think the whole process would take like 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah, so
That
the
seems
sketch...
really fast to me, though.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I certainly
No,
talk to creators who are like, oh, it took me a year and a half to come up with this,
But I think it's also difficult when you write and then you draw. Because then, you don't have you know, like you don't waste the time, like
Yeah.
drawing something that no, it's not part of the story. The writer doesn't want to include that. So I think this.
Do you have a split in your head between the writer and the artist?
I don't know. I think not. No,
Okay.
I think it's difficult because a lot of times I see if it works visually,
Yeah.
and then okay, it feels good.
Sure.
And then let's move on forward.
Sure.
Yeah.
I know I've talked to some people like Daniel Klaus I write the book from page 1 to page
Oh
last.
really? Oh right.
Then I pencil the book from page 1 to page last. Then
Wow.
I ink the book from page 1 to page last. Then I color the book from page 1. And I'm like, wow, that seems insane to me. I literally don't understand how that works, you know?
Yeah, I think it feels kind of very rigid.
Yeah. Well, but if that's what you need to
Yeah,
have
yeah,
a
that's
structure,
true.
right? Because
Yeah,
everybody's
yeah,
a little
yeah,
different in
absolutely.
how they create and
Yeah.
what they think, you know? So it's a much more organic process for you.
It's much more organic, but then I ended up sometimes doing like 20 pages that no one will see
Yeah.
because a lot of things they are not used in the final book.
Right. And is that your decision, or is that like the editor going,
David,
what's this, man?
I think it's a little bit of both,
Okay.
but all the time, or most of the time for good. Because sometimes you have more pages to explain things that are not really necessary
Sure.
for the main story.
Sure. And how much does your wife act as your sounding board here?
You see, I mean, it's interesting because my wife, it's the first editor. Before I show my editor, she says like it works or it doesn't work, and she I think she cut much more than the actual. Said no, this don't work. I can't understand, because there were really some moments that because I tend to start creating the world and like go into details, but it is a completely sometimes useless information for the main story. So my wife is the one who says, "No, this is too much, or this is too less." This is too much.
Focus.
Yeah, focus.
I love that. Okay, so you have your thumbnails. You've done them on paper. You're going to work digitally. How slavish are you to your thumbnails versus your thumbnails being just a starting point?
I think I follow pretty much what's in the thumbnails.
Okay.
Yeah, most of the time, because as I work out so much the narrative in the thumbnails, sometimes I can redraw these thumbnails, or if it's not working as a page, I add maybe a page just to make sure that you also have how is it called in English? When you open the double spread.
Yeah.
And then you have, if you have a surprise, you
Sure.
avoid
The flow and the flip.
exactly
Yeah.
the flow and the flip
Yeah.
to make sure that it's working, and then I might add some more thumbnails perhaps to show again like the drop of the rain or something, just to give some atmosphere, just to make sure that you have in the flip some surprise that will be revealed.
Here's actually an interesting question that I've never asked anyone because it didn't actually occur to me before. When you work digitally, there's not a physicality of
there
of
are
a
no
book,
originals,
right? There
yeah.
is no flip, right? The flip is
But
you have to think about it separately. Then
yeah, but that's why, for example, when I do it digitally, I create also some sort of I use InDesign, a software InDesign, so that I can see already the
see the
pages.
2 page.
Yeah, I can see
Okay.
the 2 pages.
So you do have a flip.
Yeah, I
for
do
you to
have a
work
flip
from.
to work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh. How often do you need to rewrite or change something because of that page turn, the flip?
I decide, for example, in the thumbnails. So in the thumbnails process. So once I'm doing already digitally the sketches, so I never go back to the unless the editor says, no, this is, you have to cut a little bit more, or you don't have so many pages to make the bird flying or something.
Right,
Yeah.
right. You're on like a Wacom or one of those kind of tablets?
Yeah, Wacom tablet. Yeah.
And is there a difference for you from penciling and inking, or is it all just one process once it's digital?
Yeah, there's some differences, I feel.
Okay.
It's just that I had some deadlines to reach, so I had to do it digitally. But also on paper, sometimes it takes so long because it's completely different for me. Even like the pressure, so you have to have a certain pen, and then you have to do it in a certain size. So that I decide sometimes to do it on digitally. Now, especially these two books, I did them entirely digital.
If you had all of the time in the world, would you still work digitally, or would you work on paper?
That's a good question. I would need a lot of time.
No, fair enough. Yeah.
No, I like to do it digitally because it gives some sort of speed, no? Because otherwise, for example, I couldn't have had this book launched this year.
Sure.
So I would have to do it 2020. No?
Sure. Are you're doing your own lettering?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing because I've created my own font, my own letter.
Based on your own handwriting?
Yeah, made on my handwriting. Yeah.
And so you're typing in your, like, once you have the font established.
Yeah.
You're then typing and
I'm
cutting and
typing.
pasting and.
Yeah.
Okay, that's.
So I created one specifically for this book because A Girl in the Himalaya has a completely different font.
Yeah.
I found that would be nice. So I like more this font because it looks a little bit more like my drawing. That's not entirely kind of perfect.
Yeah.
You know, there's some sort of loose
Yeah.
quality.
Yeah. No.
to it.
It looks hand lettered to me, and certainly there are places like the.
Oh yeah, this is
all the sound effects are hand lettered. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you? Does it? Just because again, I'm trying to understand process, right?
Yeah, sure.
Because I'm not. I don't do this. It's I just sell it. Does it? Are you in a different place in your head from drawing on the tablet versus kind of typing out the dialogue and then
for
shaping
sure.
and right?
For sure, it's a completely kind of different sort of mindset when you're doing those things.
Yeah.
I think, for example, when I'm typing, I'm just checking if the dialogue's flowing because this is something that I pay a lot of attention. That this is the time that you spend in the frame. So I try to not have too much dialogue in one frame.
Okay.
So that doesn't interrupt the flow of the reading experience. And this
What's your rule of thumb for the number of words in a panel?
I think usually I tend not to have, for example, too many questions and answers from characters. So a character speaks only once and not a long sentence. So I try to do it as a rule because I don't want that people get stuck in one panel.
Right.
But that has some sort of a speed that simulates some sort of film type of thing.
Yeah. But it's not film.
Yeah, it's not a film,
right?
yeah.
Comics are a completely different language, right?
Yeah, but that movement, now,
Yeah.
like you remember those boxes when like shoe boxes that you had like a film
Sure.
when you're kids, now when
Sure,
you're just passing.
sure.
So it's more or less this. So your eyes are doing this, but you are kind of seeing as a film going on. So I don't want that flow kind of breaks with too long gaps.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about Alan Moore before, and Alan Moore always is famous for
For writing long.
the whatever stops at the bottom of the page like continues into the top of the next page, right?
Yeah.
It's always the dialogue is what's controlling the page turn, as opposed to the art or the story,
That's
which is not, Alan's the only one who can kind of do that right. It's interesting. I see so many people try to do it and just fail miserably at it,
Yeah, I don't try to do that.
And then you said that your wife is coloring this?
Yeah, she's coloring. And,
the whole thing, okay.
Yeah, no, I helped also her
Okay.
to give, but to color as well. But she was helping me kind of, I don't know how many pages, but she did more than half of the book, for sure.
Yeah. And, is she doing the palette of the book? like what the tones are. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. No, I kind of decide with her.
Okay.
So they kind of decide together. So we wanted also a colorful palette because I had the tendency to, to put sometimes the colors not so vibrant
Sure.
as you would have in a, in a South American sort of setting. So yeah, so she helps me a lot to find the right sort of palette. So we choose together, and then I mean, actually, she helps me in every step really of the book. Especially, if the narrative is not work, she will tell me because she's the first reader.
Right. Yeah.
She's the first reader, and but the colors is something that she kind of influenced directly also.
And I mean, there's a fair amount of monochromaticity. That's not even a word, probably. But like in terms of when she shoots the bow, and then the whole page becomes yellow from the lightning. Is that her influence? Is that just how you see it?
It was her influence.
Okay.
Because what we wanted to do, it's again like the speed of reading. For example, just to give an example, Alex Ross comics. You spend a long time looking because it's so beautiful.
Sure.
So we wanted to do it more like graphic. So that there's not so much information. So like the strong color makes it much quicker for you to read than if we would have like maybe some clouds at the back, some smoke coming. So this was intentional.
I think the first time I read the book, I think it took me half an hour to get through the whole book. And then I went and reread it probably twice, and it took me much longer on the rereads. But the first time, it was very boom, 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 which is one of the strengths of comics, right? That it happens really fast. Do you listen to music when you do comics? Are you silent? What do you need in terms of sound around you?
Sometimes, for example, to write the thumbnails, because that's the thing. I write sometimes the story while I'm doing the thumbnails.
Yeah.
So it's not that I type the text and then I go do the thumbnails, but at the same time.
Yeah.
So that time of the process, perhaps some music could help to get to that mood, maybe of I don't know, of something epic, maybe Lord of the Rings soundtrack and all things.
Okay. Is there a difference between listening to fast-paced music versus slow-paced music when you're, like in terms of the beat, right? Because so much of comics is rhythm.
Yeah. For sure, it influences, but I think most of the time I don't listen much to music. Only if there is a specific moment that I have to, to convey a certain message or a certain emotion. Then I try to get a similar emotion in music. But most of the time I don't listen to music.
Okay.
I think this would definitely influence if I would read like a fast-paced music.
Sure. And how much do you think in terms of kind of the 9-panel grid, the 12-panel grid? Like, I mean, in most cases you're stacking 4s.
Yeah.
Right? So theoretically it's a 16 beat.
Yeah.
You never have 16 panels on the page, right? But you're 4 and 4, 4 and 4. Is that a conscious thing, or is that just a thing that happened on the page?
This was a conscious thing, and this was perhaps this was a Easter egg as well because I thought what I really wanted to tell stories, it was kind of superheroes in the past. So what I really want, but now I don't like much to read now superheroes, but I still have that feeling that, for example, maybe when I see films like Avengers, I would like those characters. But at the same time, I cannot write those types of stories now because they were written already. So why would I write them now?
Sure.
So there is a feeling to it, I think, in this book. That's why you felt like the superhero sort of theme, and the grid it's exactly the grid of Dark Knight Returns. That's what
Sure,
I based
it
the
is.
16.
The 16, yeah.
So this was I liked so much. This was my favorite comic when
Yeah.
I was kind of younger.
Yeah.
I think still kind of my favorite comic book. I like actually more Dark Knight than Watchmen because somehow Dark Knight, that's a positive ending, but
Yeah.
Watchmen it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
But there's some sort of a sadness to it.
There is, yeah, there is. It's interesting too that you point out that Dark Knight's a 16 and Watchmen's a 9.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it changes the tone of the book in a lot of ways. The
Yeah.
rhythm of the page. It's like it's a thing that we all know, but no one ever really talks about. I find.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
It has. I've chosen also 16 because I can show more panels per page. Mm-hmm. And for example, and I have a limited amount of pages that I can have in a book. Otherwise, it kind of can impact the price of the book and the printing and everything. So I think I want to tell as much or to show as much as I can to convey that, like the details, maybe I even wanted to do more in this book, but we had just 160 pages.
It's interesting because when you look at so many American comics, they're like on 6s. They're not even on 9s, right? They're on 6s, and so
because it takes more time also for you to draw
Yeah.
if you have to do so many panels.
yeah,
Yeah.
fascinates me. I'm sorry. I'm getting way into the weeds, man. I'm sorry. Do you guys have any more questions? No? Yes, Miranda does. Please.
I'm just thinking a little bit about your art style. I think there's a lot of artists who have such a distinct fingerprint. You can see from across the room, you're like, I know who that is. And your art in this book is fairly distinctive even from Girl in the Himalayas. And is that just different subject matter required a different sort of feel, or is it an evolution in your style? Not that they were so far apart, but...
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of evolution, but again, it's for me again the timing. As I knew that I had to use color in this one, so I decided to make it a little bit more simplistic. I don't know if it's the right word, but it's a little bit more sketchy. A little bit more sketchy. So a little bit more, because I know when you add color, it tends to hold the illustration. It gets a little bit heavier. So I wanted to do it a little bit looser. Yeah, the stroke, so that still there's some dynamism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very dynamic. I would think that very much. Yeah.
So it was definitely on purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it just felt interesting, right? Because the Girl in the Himalayas was a bit softer, which makes sense both with the characters and obviously snow. But this felt a little bit more angular, which makes sense a little bit with some of the cultures of the characters, but then also it sounds like with some of that fast sketchiness. So
Yeah. So I think, there was not so much about the culture, but definitely about the fast pacing and the dynamism.
very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I loved this book. I really did. I thought this was a great book, and I thank you for making it. No, I'm serious. This is a really good book. It's thoughtful. It has a point. It's showing us things that we haven't seen, and giving us ways of thinking about things. That's terrific. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for making such a great point.
Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So I have no. Do you have any questions for me? No. Yeah. No. So let's stop there. If you're at home and you haven't yet gotten a copy of New World, get this book. This is a great book. This is what comics is and can be, and it's fantastic, and yet it's real, and if you're a superhero guy, you'll like it, and if you're not, you'll also really like it. You found this really interesting path between these worlds that I think is fascinating.
Yeah, because I didn't really want to do something historic in the sense that it's boring for people to read. No? for me, from the beginning, it has to work as a story of a hero, no, like
Yeah.
a hero journey,
Yeah.
and forget like that this really happened, no? Like some of the historic aspects of the
Yeah.
book.
And it follows that, and yet it doesn't, and yet it feels new to me. It doesn't feel like something I've ever read before, you know, and that's one of the reasons I liked it so much. So, the book is New World. David Jesus Vignolli is our author, and I want to thank you for coming out. I want to thank you in the audience for coming out. I want to thank you who are watching at home. I want to thank The Beat for sponsoring this. They're a great sponsor, and every month they help us bring great books to people. Next month's book, which is actually this month because it's October, but next month's book is Assassination, which is a completely different book in every way, shape, and form. There are no two things in common with these two books, and yet this is also a great book. Kyle Starks and Erica Henderson. Kyle and Erica are going to be here on Wednesday, October 23rd. So that's the next meeting of the Graphic Novel Club. I hope you can make it. I hope you watching at home will see it. Thank you. Thank you. Seriously though, good book. Read this book. Get this book. You do it. Okay? And I want to thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me.